Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking about episode 7 of season 2 of Ultimate Spider-Man called Spidah-Man. Okay, while I don't feel this is a bad episode, I can't say I consider it to be a particularly strong episode. This is really just the let's make fun of Boston episode, or at least, yeah, basically that's what it is. It's let's make fun of Boston, let's make fun of the Boston accent. And I gotta really help but wonder how folks who are watching this, outside of the United States, who may not be familiar with the Boston accent or a lot of the sort of stereotypes that we Americans have of folks from Boston. I really imagine that a lot of the humor in quotes, of course, of this episode is probably going to be lost on them. So before I get into it, let me just offer a quick explanation. A lot of this is basically riffed on episode is about riffing on the Boston accent, which is famous for not really having R's. People say instead of park the car, they say park the car. If you really want an example, President Kennedy was a guy who had a very noticeable Boston accent, and also, of course, his spiritual successor, Mayor Diamond Joe Quimby of The Simpsons, also speaks in a very stereotypical Boston kind of accent. And there's other references to Boston. They're like Boston baked beans and Boston cream pie and clam chowder and Paul Revere. All right. Well, anyway, so the thing about this episode is, when going into it, I kind of initially had high hopes, despite the rather ridiculous premise once I found out what it was. Because, well, first of all, the story for this episode comes from Joe Quesada, who is currently the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. And the actual script for this episode was written by the guys from Man of Action, all of whom are experienced Marvel writers, and Quesada's longtime collaborator, Jimmy Palmenti. Like I said, two guys have been working together for a long time. They even owned Event Comics back in the 90s. They had a superhero by the name of Ash, who enjoyed a reasonable degree of popularity back then. So again, all guys with just serious long-time Marvel veterans. So really, despite the kind of silly nature of this premise here, I kind of had some decent hopes going into it. And what we got instead was basically just like I said, just like 20 some minutes of let's make fun of Boston, but let's not actually insult Boston because we don't want to get hate mail from them. So while they're obviously really riffing on the stereotypes that come from Boston, there's constantly Spider-Man talking about how great Boston is. So it's just like, for God's sakes, pick a side already. If you're going to make fun of a city and just sort of have this episode be a satire on Boston, then do it. Don't try and have your cake and eat it too. It just seems extremely wishy-washy and kind of silly. Really, I mean, from what I understand, if I remember correctly, Joe Quesada is a native New Yorker, and New Yorkers in Boston, folks from Boston, do have more than a little bit of a history of rivalry. So it just really seems to me like he wanted to make an episode that just kind of to riff on Boston, but he was just afraid to actually offend anybody. I mean, okay, we've gotten to the portion of the review where I endlessly repeat myself, so I think we need to move on. So let's move on and talk about some of the good stuff. Well, for one thing, I did like that, once again, we've got a typical Spider-Man problem. J. Jonah Jameson's put a bounty out on him. The city is after his head. Again, a real classic sort of thing to happen to Spider-Man. And I did get a big kick out of the point where somebody literally throws a kitchen sink at him, and Peter takes a moment to wait, what? Who threw a sink at me? And who carries around a sink just for the possibility of throwing it at somebody? Again, that's probably not something Spider-Man would have experienced in the comics, but it's something that if he had, he certainly would have said. So points to that. Now, our other big thing this episode is our guest star hero, Ali Osnick, aka the Steel Spider. Now, this is somebody who I don't really know that well, but as I understand it, this this does basically sort of stick to the genuine premise that goes with Ollie, that he's a teen genius who admires Spider-Man to an absolutely insane degree, so he crafts this steel spider suit to try and go out there and basically, be like Spider-Man, and it doesn't quite work out for him. In fact, the only story I can even really remember reading that had Steel Spider in it was story over in Thunderbolts during Warren Ellis's run that ended up taking a very dark riff on the characters, but it's Warren Ellis. That's kind of what he does. Still a great writer, though. The guy's written many, many fantastic books that I absolutely love, especially Transmetropolitan. You want a good comic book, go read that. But anyway, so again, as we go through this episode, it's just really just one ridiculous reference or stereotype or riff on Boston after another. It's like we get our villains. It's like, okay, so what's some stuff from Boston? Okay, we have Plymouth Rock. Well, that's actually in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We've got witch trials. That's actually in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, granted, these are all relatively close to Boston, so I guess we'll let that slide. And then we got Patriots. Well, okay, depending on who you want to talk to, you can make a pretty good case for Boston. The Boston Tea Party being the one of the places where the events happen that really sort of kicked the American Revolution off. Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, all that other fun stuff from the 1700s. But again, it's this and like the beans and pie, Boston baked beans and pie and chowder and Paul Revere. Like I said, it just strikes like, okay, like some guy sitting around like, okay, what's stuff from Boston that we can use from this episode that most people will recognize? I mean, seriously, I'm really amazed they didn't actually work in a reference to the Red Sox here. And honestly, I think maybe the only reason they didn't do that is if they did, they might have had to pay the Major League Baseball some money or something. But yeah, geez. Now, I do like that, to give Peter enough credit, when the rather ridiculous villains, the Boston Terror Warrior, oh God, I can't even bring myself to say that properly. It's so ridiculous. I mean, he does sort of pick up on the fact that something suspicious is going on, which I did like because, well, Peter would have seemed incredibly dumb if he hadn't. And I do like how, at the very end, they do make a genuine emotional moment where we do see that Peter and Ollie connect on the level of feeling unappreciated. And we do see that there are some genuine similarities between these two people. If Peter hadn't been able to gain some respect from Iron Man like he had, you could sort of see that it might have been theoretically possible that he could have gone down this road. Theoretically. Peter's put together a little is better put together mentally than Ollie is, but still. And I do like that at the end of it all, Ollie has turned his admiration of Spider-Man into something that's genuinely positive. Okay, the people of Boston now have a superhero who can look out for them. But still, that genuine emotional moment just really isn't enough to override just how mostly ridiculous this episode is. And while this is intended, of course, to be a humorous show, a show aimed at kids, there's a difference between humorous and ridiculous to the point where it's impossible to enjoy it. I mean, seriously, this is not a show that's meant to be taken seriously, but I just really feel like, wow, I kind of want that 20-some minutes of my life back, because that was not well spent watching this particular episode. And that, folks, really sums it all up about what I have to say about this episode. So with that, we're going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and of course you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.